Hello students, we are now adding part 2 to the endocrine system, control of hormonal secretions. Hormones are continually excreted in the urine and broken down by various enzymes, primarily in the liver. Therefore, maintaining constant hormone levels requires ongoing hormone secretion. To increase or decrease the blood levels of a hormone, the body increases or decreases secretion. Not surprisingly, hormone secretion is precisely regulated. Generally, hormone secretion is controlled by 3 ways, and let's look at those 3 ways. And these 3 ways are regulated by negative feedback. Homeostatic mechanisms work off of negative feedback. Once a desired effect of the hormone is reached, the gland or the hormone secreting cells will stop secreting. If more of the hormone is needed, then they will be triggered to secrete the hormone and the process starts. As you will recall, we looked at the figure 8 negative feedback before. Let's look at the figure 8 with hormone levels. Hormone levels become too high. There are receptors that sense the amount of the chemical in the bloodstream or in the target cells, the responses for that hormone. All this information is taken to the control center, and if the hormone level is too high, the action that needed to be stimulated has happened. That endocrine gland will be inhibited, that hormone will not be made anymore, so the effectors find that the hormone secretion has decreased. This response, the hormone levels return toward normal. When the hormone levels drop too low, the hormone levels are measured by receptors throughout the body, and when the hormone level drops below a acceptable amount, the receptors will signal the control center. The mechanism senses the change. The control center may be in that endocrine gland, or it may be in target cells that secrete the hormone, or the hormone secreting cells are stimulated, and these hormones are secreted and the hormone levels will increase. The response, it will return toward normal until the levels are at that normal, in that normal range, and then you start the process all over again. So negative feedback is a major part of homeostasis. One of the control sources is the hypothalamus. So when you hear the word hypothalamus, remember you had the thalamus that led toward the infundibulum, toward the pituitary gland, and in between the thalamus and the infundibulum, the stalk to the pituitary gland, you have the hypothalamus. When you hear hypothalamus, you should always think homeostasis. The hypothalamus regulates homeostasis in your body. It does that in many ways, but when we're talking about the endocrine system, it controls the anterior pituitary gland, and we're going to look more at this more in detail at the anterior pituitary gland shortly. But the hypothalamus signals the anterior pituitary gland, and then that anterior pituitary gland will respond, and then the peripheral endocrine gland responds. The hormone is released to the target cells, and the action of those target cells is achieved, and then by negative feedback everything starts all over again. Okay, let's look at some of the hormones from the hypothalamus. The hormone the hypothalamus itself can release hormones, and these hormones are two different types. They can be hormones that will cause the releasing of more hormones. So it's like this is an example here, the prolactin. Lactose, is the sugar found in milk. Prolactin, so you can look at that word and you can probably guess what happens with prolactin. It is a hormone that causes the breast milk to be, or the breast tissues to be stimulated to produce breast milk. And so prolactin releasing factor can be released by the hypothalamus whenever near the end of pregnancy and after the baby has been delivered. This prolactin releasing factor can be released by the hypothalamus, and that hormone will go to the anterior pituitary, where the anterior pituitary will release the hormone prolactin, which stimulates that mammal to produce milk. Or the prolactin release inhibiting hormone can be produced by the hypothalamus, and that inhibitor will go to the anterior pituitary, and it will prevent the prolactin hormone from being released. So there are two different types of hormones that can be released from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, and it can be releasing hormone or an inhibiting hormone. Now it's sort of like, remember when we talked about the excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters? Well, these hormones are chemicals that either will stimulate the anterior pituitary to release a particular hormone, or it inhibits. The hypothalamus releases a hormone that inhibits the production of that particular hormone. So that's from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. Another source is the nervous system. Now, throughout your body, you have receptors, chemoreceptors. These chemoreceptors are stimulated by particular chemicals that are found in the interstitial fluids, in the bloodstream, in the cerebral spinal fluid, and these receptors send the information to the nervous system near the thalamus and the third ventricle in the brain. It allows this hypothalamus to have constant information about internal environment when it comes to the amount of chemicals, the amount of hormones. It can be things like ions, like the amount of sodium in the blood or the amount of calcium in the blood, the amount of fluids, whether fluids need to be retained or fluids need to be excreted. All these receptors throughout the body, whether they're in blood vessels or in the brain, this information is sent to the brain, to the nervous system, and that also can regulate whether or not certain hormones are released to the target cells for the action. Okay, so internal environment, neural connections that can control the release of hormones to regulate, with negative feedback again, the amount of these chemicals found in the body. You have non-hormonal substances, and again, like I mentioned just a minute ago, it could be ions in the blood, such as the amount of sodium, potassium, which is highly regulated. You need sodium and you need potassium for things to happen. You need calcium, the correct calcium levels for muscle contraction and nerve impulse. For neurotransmitters to be released, you need calcium. So the calcium levels in the blood can also elicit a change in the endocrine gland and the releasing of hormones to go to the target cells. The action would be to increase where there are deficiencies, or decrease where there is an overabundance of whatever. Okay. These are the major endocrine glands. You must know all these glands, the hormones that they secrete, and the general function of each of these hormones. And you have been provided with a chart that lists these hormones, these glands, and the hormones they secrete, and the function of those hormones. I'm going to stop here, and we will pick up with part 3, looking at the various glands.